The news breaks like a bell toll. Ozzy Osbourne is gone. 76 years old. Tuesday morning, July 22, 2025. A heart attack at home, after years of fighting a body that had taken more than its share of damage and still asked for one more chorus. The world stops, just for a beat, to listen to the silence that follows the last scream of the Prince of Darkness. If you're watching this to remember him, to honor him, tap the like button as a small gesture of respect. We begin not with noise, but with quiet. Because sometimes the quiet says more. He was the voice of a generation that refused to behave. The boy from Aston who grew up in cramped rooms and cracked shoes, who turned the ache in his chest into a sound nobody had ever heard before. He wasn't supposed to become a legend. The odds never allowed for that. And yet, how do you explain a life like this except to admit that sometimes chaos is a calling? The story everyone knows starts in Birmingham's grey light, where four young men stitched dread and groove into a single word: Sabbath. The music did not ask permission. It thundered in, rewrote the room, and left scorch marks on the walls. But fame is a poor anesthetic, and sooner or later the pain gets through. Even the greatest frontmen in heavy metal history can discover there's a cliff at the end of applause, and one night, in 1979, he went over it. He would tell you himself, it wasn't the end. It was a pivot. The fall that becomes the beginning. Sharon believed, Randy Rhoads soared, and a solo career detonated that would carry him for decades. The crown never sat straight, but it never fell. There were always two Ozzies. One who bit into the madness and made a meal of it. And the other, the man who woke up the next day and paid the bill. The body keeps score. December 2003, an ATV accident that crushed the future into pieces and put him in a coma. He fought back, inch by brutal inch, and turned recovery into an encore. Then 2019, a fall that required neck surgery, a public admission of Parkinson's disease that the world treated like a curtain call, but he refused to accept as such. "I'm not ready to hang up my mic," he'd say in interviews, half defiant, half tender, fully Ozzy. He was never done until the house lights told him to go home. Fast forward to July 5, 2025, Villa Park, Birmingham. A farewell show with the men who started it all. A reunion not just of a band, but of an era. The stage lights bloom like sunrise over steel. Ozzy, fragile, fierce, steps into a roar that seems to lift him off the floor. It is love made audible. The concert is streamed to raise money for causes close to the city that raised him. You can feel the circle close, and somehow, you can feel it widen. Later, Sharon will remember his words from that night. "I had no idea that so many people liked me." That's the thing about echoes. You don't know how far they travel until you hear them coming back. 17 days later, the music stops. The official word is acute myocardial infarction, what we call a heart attack, leading to cardiac arrest. Underneath are the battles he'd been fighting for years: coronary artery disease, Parkinson's, the toll of falling and rising and refusing to let go. Death, when it arrives, is both shock and coda. The family issues a statement that reads like a hand being held across a dark room. It's the end of a set none of us wanted to see finish. We stand, instinctively, and applaud anyway. Because how else do you say thank you to a voice that carried your worst nights and made them survivable? Birmingham answers first. July 30th. Streets close, crowds gather, and the funeral procession passes the landmarks of a life. The childhood home, the bridge that bears the band's name, the mural that immortalizes the young faces before the world claimed them. Flowers are everywhere. On concrete, over railings, layered like a chorus of color where the city once ran in black and white. People cry. People laugh. People sing. Memory refuses to choose a single tone. Family walks slowly: Sharon, Amy, Kelly, Jack, Lewis, pausing where the fans' letters have piled up like waves. You can grieve for a person and still celebrate a phenomenon. You can do both at once, and Birmingham does. What is the shocking truth behind Ozzy Osbourne's death? Not scandal. Not conspiracy. The truth is plainer and harder. Bodies wear out. Hearts break even when they belong to giants. It is shocking only because we have spent 50 years training ourselves to believe Ozzy was indestructible. That if anyone could outrun the math of biology, it was the man who survived addiction, survived infamy, survived the culture that sought to domesticate him, and the industry that tried to profit off every scar. But death does not care about contract writers or platinum plaques. Death arrives the same way as silence, sudden, complete, inevitable. The shock is the reminder that legends do not live forever. Their echoes do. Yet in that echo, a secret remains. He died at home, surrounded by family, after taking a bow he had earned. It's not the rock and roll cliché. It's something rarer, harder to find in the storybook of excess: closure. The last weeks of his life play like a soft fade instead of a smash cut. A hometown farewell. A mourning with the people who loved him before the world learned to shout his name. A final quiet. If there's a shocking truth here, it's that peace found Ozzy Osbourne in the end. It caught up to him, and he let it. Listen closely, and you can hear the motifs that ran under every chord he ever sang. Darkness and light, braided like barbed wire around a candle. Survival as a form of prayer. He turned his worst wounds into anthems so loud the shame had to leave the room. He taught a generation that it's possible to be both broken and brave, both chaotic and kind. He was a contradiction only if you believe people must choose between their demons and their dreams. Ozzy chose both and dared us to meet him there. There's a certain kind of night when his voice makes the most sense. The street outside your window is empty, the clock refuses to move, and something in your chest will not quiet down. You put on the track, maybe War Pigs, maybe Mama, I'm Coming Home, maybe something that takes you somewhere you barely remember, and it's like a flare rises in your ribcage. He understood that sound is a kind of medicine, a rally, a way to hold on when holding on feels ridiculous. He did that not because he was invincible, but because he wasn't. He just didn't stop. Fans don't forget the small things. The clumsy sweetness on reality TV. The way he'd blink into bright rooms like he'd just wandered in from an older, louder universe. The interviews where he'd say the unexpected honest thing and then laugh like honesty was its own punchline. The man behind the myth kept slipping into frame, and people loved him for it. He made superstardom look like a condition you could learn to live with. Not every day, not without cost, but with humor and stubbornness and a little help from the people who refused to let him fall alone. In the business he reinvented, people line up to say what he meant to them. Tributes arrive from every corner, artists who built careers in his shadow, kids who found their first identity in a riff he made famous, critics who once misunderstood him and now admit they were hearing the future and didn't know it. In a world that moves fast and forgets faster, this is the rare moment when the crowd pauses to measure the size of the absence. Even the loudest room leaves space for a legend to leave. Meanwhile, the work of memory begins. The family gathers what the fans left behind. Letters, shirts, ticket stubs, small holy relics of ordinary lives altered by extraordinary noise. They catalog and archive, making sure the love is stored somewhere safe. Flowers are mulched, their color carried forward to his resting place, an alchemy of grief into ground. It is tender, almost domestic, a counterpoint to the image of the bat-biter, the stage marauder, the man who could turn a stadium into a riot of joy and disbelief. The myth was never the whole story. The family is proof. And beyond the family, beyond the immediate storm of mourning, the legacy machine moves with care. A biopic, long discussed, keeps moving forward, not to replace the songs, but to introduce the boy and the husband and the survivor to people who only knew the legend. You cannot compress 50-plus years into 2 hours, but you can etch the outline of a life in motion. The hunger, the harm, the hilarity, the heart. Somewhere a writer stares at a blank page and tries to catch lightning with a pencil. Good luck. We've all been trying for half a century. If you ask what comes next, the answer is simple. The songs keep working. They keep doing what they've always done, stitching courage into people who need it at 2 a.m., reminding teenagers that the world can be loud in the right ways, giving parents a language to pass down that isn't delicate but is fiercely true. A riff doesn't die. A lyric finds new throats. Bands form in cheap garages, and someone writes down words that feel stolen from a future older and wiser than they are, and we begin again. There are moments in every life when the noise quiets and you have to decide who you've been and who you're still trying to be. Ozzy Osbourne faced those moments in public, messy, and magnificent. He told you the truth even when it made him look small, and in doing so he stood taller than most. If you admired the bravado, fine. If you stayed for the candor, better. If you learned to forgive yourself because he showed you how, then you understand the point. The camera pulls back. The stage is empty now. Cables coiled like sleeping snakes. The mic where it always stands, waiting for the next confession. In the rafters, the echo hangs a second longer than physics should allow. Then it drifts, finds other rooms, other lives. Legends do not live forever. But they don't leave either. They linger in the work, in the way you carry yourself after the song ends, in the grin you wear when the world expects a wince. If these words stirred something in you, if you have a memory of a concert, a song that rescued you, a moment when his voice made the difference, share it below. Tell us who you were when you first heard him. Tell us who you became. And if you're the quiet type, that's okay too. Just sit a minute in this silence. Let it hold you. Somewhere, for once, the man who carried so much noise is finally resting. Rest now, Ozzy. No more pain. Only light. Morning light in Los Angeles is blunt and ordinary. It doesn't care whose house it's touching. It climbs the hedges, washes the driveway, finds the same familiar blinds and the same faithful flaws in the kitchen tile. In those last days, that's what Ozzy woke up to: simple brightness seeping under a door, the soft percussion of a kettle, the low murmur of a life that had finally slowed to something human. He had learned to meet the day as it came, not as he used to drag it, screaming, onto a stage. He would shuffle a little, smile a little, curse a little, ask where the bloody remote had run off to this time, and then go sit by the window that gave him the longest view of the trees. Breathing as ritual. Sunlight as rehab. Peace, rehearsed one quiet morning at a time. You'd expect the end of a legend to look like a movie, all sirens and spotlights and statements at a podium. But the truth is far simpler and more shocking because of it. Bodies finish. Hearts, after years of faithful service and spectacular abuse, declare a final intermission. And what remains is the room, the chair, the people who loved him, the halo of ordinary around an extraordinary life. There's a dignity in that kind of ending that heavy metal never promised, but somehow delivered anyway. He didn't vanish in a blur. He landed in a hush. He was held. To understand why that matters, you have to go backward, past the platinum, past the riotous tours, past the caricature of the bat and the snarling grin, to a boy named John in Aston who didn't yet know that vowels could be sung into weapons. Birmingham was all soot and muscle then. Factories exhaled, sirens called men home, and kids were taught early which streets were theirs and which belonged to the night. John had a brain that learned sideways and a heart that felt too much. The world did not consider either a gift. He took jobs that made no sense to a boy who kept hearing music turn footsteps into rhythm. He stumbled, did things that boys do when they're told they won't do much. And then a sound cracked him open. For boys from Liverpool, harmonies that wore their joy like a crown, a backbeat that made the earth sit up straighter. He'd say later that the Beatles didn't save him so much as dare him to imagine he could be saved. Bands form the way storms do: pressure, heat, a name suddenly built out of air. There were mates with instruments, a guitarist whose hands had learned to wrestle destiny into new shapes, a bassist who wrote words like they were spells, a drummer who could pound a room into obedience. They tuned down, they leaned into the dread in the air, they let the gloom of their city become a cathedral for noise. They were not tidy or polite. They were necessary. When the first record staggered into the world like a midnight visitation, something permanent shifted. The music felt like it knew you even if you hadn't introduced yourself to your own worst thoughts yet. It was a mirror that didn't flinch. And at its center was a voice that did not apologize for the way pain sounded when it learned to sing. Fame is tutoring by fire. It teaches quickly and charges interest. John became Ozzy in rooms that smelled like electricity and fear. Crowds treated him like a ritual. Critics treated him like a crime. The industry wrapped him in contracts that celebrated what the music did to other people's bodies and mostly ignored what it was doing to his. He did what many do when 1,000 hands are on your shoulders at once. He reached for bottles and chemicals that promised to teach his nerves how to sit quietly. They never do. They only teach you new ways to suffer. The machine kept turning. The shows kept selling. The legend kept expanding like a bruise. If you've ever stumbled, you know that the floor is rarely where you think it is. By the end of the 70s, Ozzy had fallen through the net his own name should have provided. He was fired from the band that had made him inevitable. There's a photograph in the Mines Museum, a hotel room, curtains that don't ever really close, the taste of all night on the tongue, a man whose own voice has turned into static. The phone rings. It's not the past calling to gloat. It's the future calling to negotiate. Sharon sees something where others saw only cost. She places a belief on the table and asks him if he wants to try again. Second acts should be studied for how they begin. Not with triumph, but with one good day, then another. You stop shaking long enough to hold a microphone without strangling it. You meet a guitarist whose notes don't just decorate your voice, they lift it like a prayer. You enter a studio still believing you might be the strangest creature there, and you exit with a record that introduces your second name. For other people, solo career is a marketing phrase. For Ozzy, it was a jailbreak. He didn't outrun his demons. He taught them to keep time. He turned pain into merchandise, and then into ministry. The crowds came back. The rooms got bigger. The ghost in his chest didn't leave, but it learned he was not negotiable. Then grief fell out of the sky. Not metaphor. A real plane and a terrible morning that folded Randy Rhoads into the kind of silence even music can't argue with. Ozzy tried to drink the hole closed. It didn't work, it never does. He hurt. He raged. He asked questions the ceiling refused to answer. And then, again, he did the one thing he knew how to do. He sang. Some songs sound like letters to the living. These sounded like letters to the dead. He toured as if motion could soften the edges of absence. It didn't, but it kept him from being devoured by stillness. People forget, survival isn't pretty. It's repeating yourself back to yourself until you believe you are actually here. You may have your own entry point into his catalog. Maybe you heard a riff that felt like a staircase you could climb when the ground went unfriendly. Maybe you recognized your family in the cracked tenderness of a ballad that sounded like an apology wrapped around a promise. Maybe you were never a metal person at all and still found a way to the man, because the man kept intruding on the myth with his silliness, his affection, the goofy grace that fame never managed to beat out of him. That's the secret of his reach. The costume was an exaggeration, not a lie. The bite was theater. The heart was documentary. Bodies collect interrupts. In 2003, a machine meant for leisure turned violent and tried to write him down to zero. He floated in the near-nothing of a coma while the world argued about who he had been and who he would be if he returned. And then he did return, slowly, painfully, in increments you don't clip into a highlight reel because they are so ordinary you almost miss how sacred they are. Grabbing a fork without shaking. Taking 5 steps without help. Remembering a line well enough to sing it when the tape starts rolling. Those are the victories you earn at the end of a war the audience rarely sees. He gathered them like small trophies and put them on the shelf in his chest. Years later, he fell again. The body that had held so much voltage decided to short out, and all the swagger in the world cannot negotiate with biology. Parkinson's isn't a disease, it's a weather system that moves into your life and changes the season without asking. Ozzy did what he'd been doing since the beginning. He talked about it. Not with playlists of denial, but with these cracked little admissions that made him sound like your uncle in the kitchen saying something brave, because the coffee is finally strong enough. I'm wobbling. I'm not done. I'm still here. The power of a legend confessing human limits is not that it lowers the god, it raises the congregation. Sharon remained the axis. Say what you will about the mythologies that encircle famous marriages, this one kept finding a way to choose itself again. She knew when to shove, when to shield, when to send him back on stage like a general who trusts the soldier and the soldier's stubborn heart. He knew when to listen, which was not always, and when to ask forgiveness, which was more often as the years asked him to grow new kinds of patience. People love to romanticize the chaos. It is more romantic, in the end, to witness 2 people aging into a tenderness the tabloids never headlined. That's the part that matters when the buses are parked and the arenas have gone to sleep. And then there was the hometown. Birmingham waited like an old friend who doesn't need to say much to be understood. When the farewell show was announced, it felt like a pilgrimage disguised as a concert. Not because anyone thought a city could cure someone's illness, but because places hold versions of us we sometimes need to visit to remember we're still made of something unbreakable. The crowd that night sounded like a heart refusing to let go. The set list was more than songs. It was a ledger, a spiritual inventory. Who I was, who you were, what we became together, what we're willing to admit now that the end is waving from just off stage. He bowed in a way that made you want to bow back. After that night, the days simplified. He did the small things that big lives forget to notice. Fed the dog. Answered a message from a kid who said a song made living possible one more week. Laughed at a memory that used to hurt. Slept, not the feral sleep that follows obliteration, but the honest sleep that follows a day carefully spent. This is the part that surprises people who have only met their heroes at a screen. There is a version of peace reserved for those who wrestled their own weather and learned to say, without soundtrack, enough. When the heart stopped, the narrative tried to take over. You saw it in headlines, blunt words marching forward, death, cause, age survived by. The world consumes details the way crowds consume encores, more. But families are tasked with a different work, the stewardship of the private. They carried their grief like something living, not like content. They made time elastic, letting it be long where memory needed to sit, letting it be short where pain needed to sleep. If you've ever stood at a kitchen counter and cried into a dish towel because that's where the crying happened to find you, you know this ritual. Legend or not, grief is a domestic animal. It lives in the house. The city came because cities can love people too. Flowers and murals and the slow choreography of a procession that teaches a population how to move as one. Old songs became hymns. Loud kids cried the way loud kids always do, with full bodies and no apology. Someone lifted a child onto their shoulders so he could see a future the rest of us were squinting at. The river of people wanted to touch not just the memory of a man, but the idea that you can outgrow the ugliest expectations laid on you as a kid and still keep the silly, shining parts. They wanted permission to believe that survival isn't ugly. They got it. And of course there were the arguments. There always are when the internet sits down to remember. Was he the father of this or that genre? Was the stagecraft any good or just gaudy? Was the show better in 78 or 83 or during the reunion or in that one bootleg at that one venue your friend swears you had to be there to understand? The bickering is love in a cheap jacket. It keeps the pulse going. Somewhere inside all that noise, a real truth hums. The work matters precisely because we can argue about it forever. It refuses to finish. It goes on without the man, and yet, in some stubborn way, it keeps him. Money and legacy meet in rooms without guitars. Lawyers speak in the soft tones of people who are very good at math and very bad at admitting they can't fix the one problem everyone is actually worried about. Trusts are affirmed. Royalties are routed. Causes are named with the same care you used to fold a shirt that belonged to someone you miss. You can be cynical about it. You can say it's business. You can be right. And still, here's what else is right. The music will fund things that tilt the world a degree kinder in his name. That's a decent way for noise to spend its afterlife. Meanwhile, the kids, by which I mean anyone younger than the ache they carry, keep discovering him in thrift store CDs and algorithmic accidents, and the tattooed memory of their parents. There is always a first time you hear that voice. It might be in a car that smells like fries and independence. It might be in a room where you finally decided to let yourself feel the thing you've been avoiding. It might be in headphones while you sit on a curb after the worst day, watching a sky that can't decide whether to weep or behave. Art finds you when you've run out of dignified plans. Ozzy was good at that kind of ambush. He made believers out of bystanders. If you are waiting for the scandal that explains everything, you will be waiting a long time. The shocking truth is not a twist. It is a reveal that was always in plain sight. He was a man who should not have lived this long. He was a boy who should not have become this big. He was an addict who should not have found this particular stubborn peace. And yet, the miracle is not the noise he made. It's the fact that he learned to turn the noise down and still be himself. He didn't die a story, he died a person. That's rarer than we admit, particularly for those we've built altars to while pretending the altars are just stage props. So what now? Now you choose. You choose which version of him you carry forward, the monster and the mime, the scream and the smile, the showman and the shaky old man who still wanted to sing. You choose not because one is truer, but because all of them are, in different weather. You choose because the next time the night gets loud in the wrong ways, you'll need a soundtrack that understands the difference between giving up and giving in. He did. He learned to stand where he could, sit where he had to, and bow when it was time. Some evenings still demand volume. Turn it up. Let the speakers make a lyre out of the quiet. Other nights will insist on softness. Light a dim lamp. Sit in the chair by the window. Remember the man who learned to do both. If you were part of the roar, thank you. If you're part of the hush now, thank you. Both belong to him. Both belong to you. When you're ready, tell me your version. The first song. The last show. The moment in the middle when you realized he wasn't just trying to be scary, he was trying to be honest. Then hold that memory the way he held the mic, tight enough to mean it, loose enough to let it breathe. Say it with me, just once more, quietly this time so we can hear it land. I'm still here. And then, like he finally learned to do, let the silence answer back. You can feel the world recalibrating in the days after, as if someone reached over and turned down the master volume on everything and left the quieter channels intact. In Tokyo, a street drummer outside Shibuya Station plays a Sabbath groove that makes commuters miss their trains on purpose. In Sao Paulo, a bar that used to throw people out for singing too loudly opens the windows and lets a line of kids howl the chorus into the humid night. In Warsaw, a gray morning becomes a choir when a dozen strangers with bad coffee and better memories decide the only answer to silence is a harmony. Cities invent their own rituals when they lose someone who built rooms out of noise. They gather, they listen, they make more of the thing that's missing, because that's how you keep absence from swallowing everything else. A letter goes viral, not because the handwriting is pretty, but because the story is painfully ordinary. It's from a nurse who worked too many night shifts and got too good at not crying in hallways. She writes about the winter night when a patient coded and then came back, eyes wild, asking what year it was, about the late lunch she ate alone in the stairwell because the break room still smelled like a bad phone call, about the moment she put "Mama, I'm coming home" in her ears at 4:12 a.m. and found enough oxygen in the melody to walk back out there and be brave again. She doesn't claim the song saved her. She says it kept her company. Sometimes that's the difference between quitting quietly and trying again tomorrow. That's what his music kept doing when nothing else volunteered. In one of the old tour trunks that still live in a storage unit off a freeway that never sleeps, Rhodey digs through cables that remember more about the past than any of us do. He finds a gaffer-taped set list with blood on the corner, a small cut, a big night. And laughs because of course he remembers that show now. He remembers the joke Ozzy told in the wings 5 minutes before walking out. Something silly and unrepeatable that still did its job. Broke the tension, broke the myth, let a human walk into a roaring machine and call it home. That's what the crew misses most, they say. Not the fireworks or the madness, but the way he made the grind feel like a miracle you lucked into. The way he'd look at a rigging guy 60 feet up and give a thumbs up like he was blessing the entire architecture of faith that makes shows possible. Producers start to talk about the vault the way sailors talk about whether they can feel in their knees. There are reels and drives and half-labeled files. There are demos that sound like confessions left on answering machines. There are takes where the lyric doesn't exist yet, and the melody is just a shape he's carving with his breath. Some labels circle like they smell a holiday release. Some fans shout about purity or theft, and in a small, sunlit room, the family looks at each other and decides that if anything at all comes out, it will come out slow and honest. There is music made to be consumed and music made to be kept. Not everything needs an audience. A legend's last great gift can be restraint. The last session is a story that refuses to become dramatic because the people in it won't let it. A microphone, a chair, a voice that arrived that day wearing a coat of tired and a lining of brave. He sang something he'd been humming to himself in the mornings. Not a stadium song. Something small, like a benediction you say under your breath. He didn't chase notes. He allowed them. He didn't wrestle the air. He invited it. Later, the engineer would swear there was a moment when the room felt warmer, like the sound itself had leaned over and put a hand on the console and said, "Keep this safe. You can make up your own mysticism if you need it." What matters is that the recording exists and, for now, is sleeping. Not all lullabies are for children. Sharon begins to appear in public the way people do when they've rehearsed composure and insist on telling the truth anyway. She thanks the crowds that line the streets. She thanks the bands that paused their shows to say his name. She thanks the critics who couldn't stand him once and somehow loved him now for refusing to be easy. Then she says the sentence that knocks the breath out of a room. He left when he was ready. Not because he wanted to leave, no one who loves life wants to, but because he understood there is a mercy in bowing when the body you've been riding like a stolen car finally needs you to hand back the keys. It is a generous interpretation. It is also the only one that keeps grief from becoming a grudge against the universe. Bandmates go on camera and tell stories that sound like footnotes to chaos. One remembers a night when the monitors died and he decided to sing by watching the way the crowd's faces changed, the cheapest metronome in the world. Another remembers a fight that began because someone touched the wrong jacket and ended because Ozzy turned the argument into a Shaggy Dog story that had everyone laughing at how ridiculous we all are when we pretend our small kingdoms deserve a war. A third talks about prayer, which isn't a word people expect to hear from men with battered flight cases and destroyed eardrums. He says they used to hold hands before the house lights went down, not because they were pious, but because synergy is easier when you start by admitting you're mortal. Journalists try to trap the point in headlines with teeth. They circle the bat story like it's a campfire they built themselves. But the story that sticks is older and dumber and wiser. A man who kept getting up. You can thread gold through the famous scandals, but the stitch that holds the whole garment together is stubbornness. He didn't beat the odds so much as outlast them. He was never flattered by invincibility. He was irritated by it. It bored him. He preferred the work, the messy, unglamorous work of taking a breath when your lungs have unionized against effort, of walking out to greet a crowd even when every cell suggests you sit and tell them you're sorry. He did it until he couldn't. And then he didn't pretend. There's a quiet legal drama no one wants to watch because there are no special effects for grief that happens at a conference table. There are documents with red ribbons and clauses that sound like they were written by a language that mistrusts adjectives. The children are careful. They align the money with the man. A portion goes to the city that taught him how to be loud. A portion goes to people whose tremors have names, to research that keeps other families from learning words you only want to know from a distance. A portion goes to animals who don't understand celebrity and don't need to, because mercy is fluent in every language that matters. It is possible to be cynical about all of this. It is also possible, truer I think, to be moved by the way noise is being converted into help. Somewhere, a film school class is arguing about how you would tell this story if you only had 2 hours and a studio note that says, "Make it feel like redemption." They storyboard the Aston House and the first gig and the crash and the confession and the farewell. Someone suggests a scene where the older Ozzy watches the younger Ozzy on a screen and talks back to him. It's too neat, the professor says, and they're right. Real lives don't rhyme that perfectly, but they do echo. If the biopic ever arrives, the best scene will be the one where nothing happens and you finally understand what he spent a lifetime discovering, that endurance, not spectacle, is the real rebellion. Fans begin to curate their grief the way the internet taught us to, playlists that start soft and get loud enough to carry you into the day, photographs scanned from paper that went through too many moves, ticket stubs with sweat preserved like a fossil of a night that almost ate you and didn't. What's new is how generous they are with the parts of themselves the music retrained. People are less embarrassed to say, "I was bad at being alive, and this helped." That's a kind of literacy we didn't have when he started. Maybe that's the legacy that matters most. He made it easier to tell the truth about what it costs to keep showing up. The last day becomes a myth factory, of course, because we are afraid of boring endings and because celebrity trains us to expect a twist. But the most reliable account has no plot. A morning, a familiar room, coffee he pretended he didn't like and then always drank anyway. A joke about getting old that wasn't really a joke. A dog. A song hummed absent-mindedly because sometimes melody is how the body counts its blessings. Then the body stopped. The machine that had powered 1,000 nights of borrowed immortality exhaled and did not inhale and left us with a kind of quiet you either curse or learn to carry. If you want fireworks, you can put them here. If you want truth, leave the room as it was and let the light through the blinds do the work. People ask, as they always do when a legend goes, what do we do with this? The answer is insulting in its simplicity. You do what he did. You survive yourself as many times as it takes. You lower your voice when you need to hear the smaller things. You tell the truth even when it makes you look foolish. You sing badly, beautifully, whatever your throat offers. Because air moving through a human body makes a sound that reminds us we exist. You forgive yourself for not being a monument. You become a room for someone else's noise and a shelter for your own. If you're waiting for permission, this is it. Put on the song that makes the most sense right now. Sit with it until the edges of the day stop nagging. Send a message to the person who shared that track with you when you were a different person and thank them for giving you a way back to yourself. If you have nothing to say, lend your ears. If you have too much to say, write it down and let the words be as messy as they need to. A life like his doesn't ask for tidy tribute. It asks for honest use. There will be anniversaries. There will be candlelight on sidewalks and murals touched up by hands that weren't alive when the first records arrived. There will be think pieces that try to decide, finally, once and for all, where he belongs in the syllabus. None of that will matter at 2 a.m. When someone who has never learned to pray whispers a thank you to a song that just kept them from making a phone call they couldn't take back, that is where the legend continues. In the private victories with no witnesses. In the quiet rescues no Hall of Fame will ever catch. Maybe that's the shocking truth the title promised and took so long to admit. Ozzy Osbourne was not a myth who masqueraded as a man. He was a man who out-wrestled his myth often enough to remind the rest of us that we don't have to pick between our wreckage and our wonder. We can carry both. We can be ridiculous and holy in the same hour. We can scare ourselves with the magnitude of our appetite for noise, and then soothe ourselves with a whisper we learned from someone who kept coming back to teach it. I don't know which version of him you're holding right now. The kid with the secondhand boots. The frontman with the eyes like a dare. The patient who shook and refused to call at the end. Hold him without editing. Hold him without making him noble where he was just human. It's more generous that way. He earned that kind of remembering. If you've made it this far with me, you've already done what the man himself kept doing. You stayed. You let the story move at the speed of breath, not clickbait. You allowed the weight without demanding a trick to make it lighter. That's not nothing. That's the work. And if this chapter has left you with an ache that feels suspiciously like gratitude, good. That means we're in the right place. Stay a moment longer. Let the daylight find your face, wherever you are. Let the old noise roll through you and settle the way waves flatten into a beach after a storm has the decency to go elsewhere. Then stand up. Not because grief is over, it isn't, but because you have things to do that weren't possible without this music teaching you how to keep moving. When you're ready, we'll go again. Grief turns corners you didn't know your streets had. A month out, the world has learned how to carry his absence without dropping it, and something softer begins to happen in places you wouldn't think to look. In a tiny guitar shop on a back street in Birmingham, the owner pins a handwritten sign near the register. If you're practicing Sabbath riffs, it's on the house. Kids wander in with borrowed enthusiasm and leave with calluses starting to form, fingertips a little sore, heads a little higher. They don't talk about legacy, they talk about tone. They don't argue about eras, they argue about strings. And that's perfect. Myth is enormous, but music is specific. You hold it in your hands. You fight for each note until it stops being someone else's power and starts being your own. Sharon keeps moving through the days like a person who has refused to choose between steel and grace. She sits for interviews not because she needs the publicity, but because silence would turn into guesswork, and guesswork is unkind to the living. She won't varnish the old pain. She won't let it be the headline either. She talks about practical things in a voice that knows how to love a battlefield, the home adjustments they made when stairs became mountains, the careful, unglamorous paperwork of wills that put money where mercy lives, the way mornings became gentler when they allowed them to be ordinary on purpose. People write to thank her for telling the truth about the way love looks when the stadium empties and what remains is a kettle, a laugh that used to be louder, and a chair by a window that knows more about endurance than any biography ever will. Jack and Kelly start hearing from strangers who swear a song gave them a father they didn't have, or a sister, or a friend they could borrow in the bad weeks. They answer as many as they can. Somewhere else, a memorial concert begins to take shape, not a spectacle dressed as a seance, but a night of disciplined generosity. The title is simple because simple is harder to counterfeit. No More Tears, of A Night for Ozzy. The lineup is a latticework of eras that never quite overlapped, but always argued affectionately from opposite ends of the dial. A doom band that learned grief from crows. A pop-punk act that learned to laugh at its own melodrama. A country singer who swears a Sabbath riff taught him more about prayer than church did. No one tries to impersonate him. They do what he wanted musicians to do, bring their own weather and let it rain. Proceeds go where you'd expect, local programs for kids who need a first instrument more than they need another speech, research that turns tremors into treatment, shelters that understand mercy has teeth and fur and a heartbeat. Academics, who have spent years writing stackable arguments about the birth of heavy metal like they were constructing a tower and not a map, start a conference that nobody asked for and everyone secretly loves. The panel titles are phrases you could laugh at if you weren't also a little moved. Scream/scripture, the liturgies of loud, or brute poetics, working-class grammar and British doom. The keynote makes a case that Ozzy's voice did what sacred chant used to do in another century. It altered the room's chemistry so hard you left different than you entered, even if you couldn't cite the doctrine. People roll their eyes and still show up because there's something in the argument that explains why so many of us felt better, not worse, after the noise had its way with us. The archive yields a surprise, of course, because archives always do. Not a hidden masterpiece, those are rare and ought to stay rare, but a fragment you can't shake. 32 seconds of a voice memo on an old phone where he hums a melody and says, almost to himself, start soft, scare em later. It's nothing and everything. It is a master's ethos nearly boiled down to a recipe. It belongs in the exhibit, in the quiet room after the headphones, where people can sit and hear the gentleness that preceded the roar. The fragment doesn't get released as a single. No soundtrack. No influencer add-on. It is allowed to be small in public. The family insists, and for once, the world obeys. You might think the internet would tire of mourning, but it mutates into something useful. Musicians post covers not as additions for forgiveness, but as love letters. Teenagers film themselves playing the intro to Iron Man, with the concentration of surgeons and the joy of escape artists. A choir in Lagos translates a melody into a call and response that sounds like a metal psalm, and the comments are for once almost entirely kind. A veteran posts a shaky video thanking a song for getting him through a winter that didn't end until spring was halfway over. A mother writes about playing Changes in the car and telling her daughter that sometimes you love people best by letting them become someone you didn't anticipate. The algorithm learns, for a week, how to be generous on purpose. A rumor makes its way around the kind of private circles that pride themselves on being leak-proof. There's talk of erecting a statue that refuses to look heroic. Not a bronze god with a jawline invented by someone who never met gravity, but a man sitting on a flight case, elbows on knees, half-smile aimed at the kind of trouble that keeps you honest. The committee fights about it, naturally. Art committees were designed for this ritual. The compromise is better than anyone expected. The plinth will list not awards or dates, but 5 lines of ordinary things he loved: dogs, tea, bad jokes, a good chorus, Birmingham on a blue sky day. And an invitation, etched in steel at shin level where kids will notice it first. Start soft. Scare em later. Meanwhile, the medicine keeps learning. Labs don't stop because legends do. A grant lands in a research account named for a man who never got to see the therapy he helped pay for. Scientists don't do poetry at press conferences, but one of them tries and is forgiven for how awkward it sounds. The goal is to teach bodies to hum instead of shake. Patients smile because hope likes clumsy language. It trusts effort more than elegance. At the clinic, a kid in a hoodie drums his fingers on the edge of a chair while his mother fills out forms. He can't know yet that somewhere down the line a chorus will arrive to steady his hands. He doesn't need to know. He just needs that future to exist. There's a day when Sharon walks alone through a part of the house that still thinks it hears him, and she stops in front of a shelf where the awards sit too politely. She picks one up, not to admire it but to test its weight. Grief has taught her to measure things this way, how they feel in the hand, how they insist or yield. She puts it back and picks up a photograph instead, something printed at a pharmacy in the way back years, edges going soft with time. The picture is unremarkable. They're not on stage. They're not even in focus. They're both mid-laugh, the kind of laugh you can't plan because it belongs to the first beat after the punchline lands. She takes it with her to the kitchen, leans it against the sugar bowl, and makes tea. There are religions built on less honest altars. And then there's you, because all stories eventually point their last paragraph at whoever is listening. Maybe you've kept the volume down since he left, not because you're done with loud, but because you're figuring out what loud is for now. Maybe you've been braver with your quiet, letting it say things you used to drown out with cleverness and speed. Maybe you stood in a crowd and let 1,000 strangers carry your grief for 5 minutes, so you could remember you live in a species that knows how to do that, even now. However you got here, you're here. Breathing. Reading. Considering whether to text someone a link to a song you haven't shared in years. Do it. Give the echo another life. There will come a night, maybe soon, maybe when the calendar has stopped counting properly, when the room is too still, and you don't trust your mind to give you the better story. That's your cue. Find the track that once rearranged your furniture. Let the first note thread a wire through the dark and tug you closer to the place where you become bearable to yourself again. Start soft. Scare 'em later. And by 'em, I mean the shadows that pretend they own you. We can stay here as long as you need, in this stretch of road where the scream and the silence have learned to hold hands. The map is simple and brutal and beautiful. You loved a voice, and it taught you to love your own life enough to keep carrying it. That's the kind of inheritance that doesn't require paperwork. That's the kind you pass along with a nod and a volume knob. When you're ready, say the word, and we'll walk the rest of the way back through the music that started 1,000 rooms, through the ordinary days that saved a marriage, through the moments when an exhausted man chose to be tender instead of theatrical and rewrote what survival looks like in public. We'll go all the way to the edge again, where the last light burns a little cleaner and the air is thin enough to make every word careful. And then we'll stop, not because the story ends, but because endings are just places where breath pauses and waits for you to join in. There's a corner of the internet that pretends to hate sentiment and still can't help itself tonight. A forum that once measured worth in decibels only now trades stories measured in heartbeats. A user with a screen name made of numbers uploads a grainy photo from a show in '94 crushed under arena lights, a stage that looks like a battleship, confetti falling like snow that forgot to melt. He writes 3 sentences, each shorter than the last. I took my brother. He didn't make it past 2002. I still hear him when the chorus hits. The thread blossoms the way flowers do in places you didn't think could grow anything between concrete ribs, in the seam where asphalt surrenders to dirt. People answer with their own small gardens of memory. And for an hour, the place that usually eats tenderness for breakfast decides to let it live. In a classroom where the clock never moves fast enough, a substitute teacher who used to run lights for touring bands draws a timeline on the whiteboard, not because the curriculum asks for it, but because the kids do. He marks Aston with a squeak of dry erase and draws an arrow dark enough to almost cut the board, ending in a bubble labeled now. He talks about a voice that sounded like a building learning to feel, about a band that taught the world what fear could do if you didn't let it win, about a long road that curved where it had to and broke where it couldn't. The students don't raise their hands. They lean forward. Something in the lesson tells them that the map for surviving adolescence is hidden in the margins of a man's music who also survived himself. A letter arrives at a radio station in Birmingham that still likes its morning shows loose around the edges. Handwritten, careful, addressed to the DJ who never learned to fake his condolences. The author is an older man who signs only with his initials and a telephone number that looks like it belongs to a landline. He writes about 1970, about being broke, about buying a record with rent money and deciding he'd rather be evicted than be boring. He writes about a girlfriend who left and a factory job that didn't. About the time a lyric convinced him to keep his temper inside his jacket and go home instead of starting a fight he wouldn't win. At the end, one sentence, "I am an ordinary man," and he made that feel like a miracle. The DJ reads it on air and doesn't try to keep his voice steady. He lets the crack through. It fits the station's sound better than polish ever did. Meanwhile, the economy of myth continues its quiet, necessary work. A woman who builds guitars in a converted garage she shares with 2 cats and a space heater decides to design an instrument called the Aston. No bad inlay, no gimmicks, just a body carved from ash, a neck that refuses to bow under pressure, a finish the color of a late Birmingham afternoon. She tests it through an amp that's older than some bands and writes a note to tuck into the case for whoever buys it. The sustain is the point. Hold a note and see how long it's willing to believe in you. She donates the first sales profit to a community music program, partly because it's right, partly because grief feels less like drowning when you're building something with your hands. Jack goes for a drive he doesn't plan. It's one of those afternoons that keeps forgetting what it wants to be: sun, then cloud, then a wind that thinks it owns the place. He ends up on a hill where the city spreads out like a record sleeve left open on a floor. He rolls down the windows just enough to let the air tell him what's missing and what isn't. People assume the children of legends inherit a script. Mostly they inherit rooms that speak in a language of echoes and silence and expect you to choose which one to answer. He decides he doesn't have to choose. He can let both in. He can hold the quiet in his chest and still say his father's name out loud like a bell you ring to remind the day it has responsibilities. Across the ocean, in a rehab facility built to look like anything but a hospital, a counselor with sleeves rolled to his elbows changes the group plan at the last minute. He doesn't say why. He moves a chair into the circle and sets a phone on it, screen down, like a candle. He asks them to talk about the first noise that made them think they could live without inventing a different self every morning. It takes a while. Someone mentions a hymn sung badly by an aunt who still meant every note. Someone else laughs at himself for saying the drum break from a song his dad used to blast when saving the lawn from weeds that didn't need saving. Near the end, a woman who hasn't smiled in days says a name and a title and then closes her eyes. The room doesn't clap. It nods, the kind of nod that means keep going. The kind of nod that means we've been waiting for you to join us at the table, bravery. On a Wednesday night, a pastor who looks like a linebacker and preaches like a blues guitarist drags an old PA into a church basement for a community vigil not everyone agrees about. The sign outside doesn't say anything about saints of loudness, but inside, the folding chairs learn to negotiate with the drums. He doesn't canonize the man. He canonizes what the man allowed, truth shouted at the right volume at the right time for the right reason. He says a line people will either love or hate. God is not afraid of distortion. A few people leave early because that sentence is not the flavor of reverence they ordered. The rest stay because the room feels like a place where you can admit that light and thunder sometimes share a sentence and nobody arrests you for it. The exhibit opens on a Friday because Fridays are built for invitations. The queue wraps the block by noon, and the museum staff learns that respect can look like 100 leather jackets worn by people who still say please and thank you like full sentences. In the vocal room, the one with the headphones and the chair, everything changes volume despite signs that ask it not to. People cry in private and then pretend they didn't, which is its own kind of dignity. A teenager with chipped black nail polish takes the headphones off and whispers, "I didn't know you could sound brave and scared in the same breath." The attendant nods like she's been waiting for exactly that sentence to arrive. Outside, the gift shop sells out of postcards that don't feature a face, just a microphone standing alone under a light. People are hungry for symbols that remember to leave space for the person. There's an email the family almost doesn't open because the subject line reads simply, "Thank you." Inside is a letter from a corrections officer at a medium-security prison who runs a music hour on weekends. He writes about a room that smells like disinfectant and possibility, about a battered speaker that turns shouting into singing, about the way men who haven't cried in front of anyone in years let a melody shake something loose and call it sweat. He signs it with his full name and the words "I'm trying," which might be the only creed that counts in rooms where failure used to pay the rent. Sharon accepts an invitation to speak at a health conference because she remembers how it felt to watch doctors talk around a subject while the subject sat beside her and squeezed her hand in a code no medical chart could catch. She tells the room that the hardest part wasn't learning new words, it was learning new patience. She talks about the first time the house was modified and how the ramp felt like a capitulation until it felt like a promise. She talks about nights when they didn't sleep and mornings that needed laughter as medicine more than pills. The audience stands up when she finishes, not because they're trained to, but because gratitude is a reflex in rooms where someone risked telling the truth without making themselves a hero. In a studio 30 miles outside town, a producer stacks real boxes on the floor and draws a map on a legal pad, trying to figure out if there's a responsible way to touch the unfinished things without waking ghosts that deserve their sleep. He listens to a tape of guitar scratch tracks that sound like bone and intention. He listens to the hum of a preamp that always used to buzz at that frequency. He hears a throat clear and a quiet laugh, then a line sung half wrong and left alone because the wrongness tastes honest. He does not touch the faders. Not yet. He waits. Some work asks for your hands first. This asks for your restraint. On the high street, a shop sets a speaker in the doorway and allows the afternoon to become a playlist. People walk slower. Some stop. One woman with a baby carriage sways in place, as if remembering a language her spine learned before her mind did. A boy with a skateboard tucks it under his arm and pretends he's not listening. Then he isn't pretending. A bus driver honks once, gently, not as complaint, but as the city's version of applause. The song changes. The street discovers a collective second wind. It is possible to love a person you never met. It is possible to be loved back by work that had no idea it would one day find you. Writers who ignored him for years try to catch up without cheating. The smarter ones admit it. We misread what the noise was doing. We thought it tried to scare when it was trying to confess. Essays that would have been full of clever turns now lean into a different kind of detail. How the first 4 bars of a certain track feel like a lock picking itself, and the chorus feels like the door becoming a friend instead of a guard. They tell on themselves and are forgiven, because art exists partly to teach humility to those who talk about it for a living. The apology is a genre all its own, and when it's done well, it makes room for new listeners to arrive without shame. At a youth center painted with colors that refuse to be reasonable, a volunteer starts a weekly program called Start Soft. It is not music therapy, though music is always welcome. It is not counseling, though secrets are often gently invited to step into air. The rules are simple and gentle. Arrive as you are, let your volume match your courage. Try to be kind. If you can't, try to be quiet. If you can't be quiet, say the loud thing and we'll hold it without breaking. Kids who don't trust slogans try one week and then another and, without noticing, become custodians of their own weather. Scare 'em later hangs on the wall not as a threat, but as a promise that someday your power will be something you don't have to apologize for. The statue debate resolves with a vote that nobody wins and everybody respects. The sculpture goes up on a Tuesday when clouds pretend to be dramatic and fail. It is smaller than some wanted and truer than most expected. People take photos like pilgrims and then stop taking photos and just stand there, the way you do in front of something you recognize before you understand. At shin level, a child traces the etched words with a finger and reads them out loud, careful and proud. A man a few feet away wipes his eyes like dust got brave. The city is full of monuments that celebrate certainty. This one celebrates a man who learned, publicly, clumsily, gloriously, that uncertainty can be a teacher if you let it. The biopic inches forward, stubborn and slow. There are scripts that love the spectacle too much and scripts that love the sorrow until you want to shake them and say that isn't the point either. A director sits alone in a theater and watches archival footage on a too large screen, trying to find the camera distance that tells the truth. Not close enough to turn him into a saint. Not far enough to reduce him to a silhouette. Something in between, where the jagged parts stay jagged and the tender parts get time to glow. She writes a line on a napkin because she's superstitious and the best lines never arrive.